I'm in St Pancras Churchyard in London, and for Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, The Last Man and other novels, the woman for whom it can be said invented the genre of science fiction, this was a special and sacred place. Mary frequently visited this tomb. It is the tomb of her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, one of the foundational philosophers of feminism, who died aged 38 in 1797, just a few days after giving birth to her daughter. Mary, her mother-in-law, and her father lived just around the corner in a house long since demolished, but now memorialised with a plaque. And Mary came here so frequently as a child that she even learnt how to read here, tracing the letters on her mother's tomb. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, so similar to her own name. Years later, as a teenager, Mary would take her lover, Percy Bysshe Shelley, here to read to him, to talk to him, and to escape from the rest of the world with him. This was where, aged 16, standing in front of this tomb, she declared her love for Percy Bysshe Shelley, and, as she later put it, embraced him with the full ardour of love. Some people speculate that Percy and Mary had sex at this spot. Whatever happened here, it was certainly very meaningful and powerful for both of them. Mary Shelley's friend and fellow writer, John Polidori, was also buried in St Pancras. Polidori, who was Lord Byron's doctor, can be said to have invented the modern vampire genre through his novella The Vampire. However, his gravestone is nowhere to be found. In the mid-1860s, the writer Thomas Hardy was tasked with digging up most of the bodies and moving most of the gravestones in order to make room for a new train station, St Pancras. Unfortunately, John Polidori's grave was one of the ones that got lost in the shuffle, unlike the tomb of Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, which was moved from its original site to its new location. The graves were mostly stacked around a tree that unfortunately blew down in this storm in December 2022, although a new sapling is now growing in its place. Perhaps John Polidori's is one of the gravestones around this tree. Mary Shelley wanted to be buried here in St Pancras rather than with her husband in Rome, because she wanted to be buried with her parents and in a place that meant so much to her. However, by 1851, the year that Mary Shelley died, this was no longer the beautiful countryside graveyard it had once been. The railway was encroaching, the church was derelict, and worse still, the graveyard had a reputation for attracting grave robbers, something that was described by Charles Dickens in his novel A Tale of Two Cities. Mary's daughter-in-law, Lady Jane, was determined that Mary Shelley would not be buried here. Instead, Mary Shelley was buried here in St Peter's graveyard in Bournemouth, very close to the home of Lady Jane and her husband in Boscombe Manor. And Lady Jane honoured her mother-in-law's wishes to be buried with her parents by digging up their bodies and transferring them more than 100 miles from St Pancras graveyard in London down to the seaside town of Bournemouth. And this was despite the fact that Mary Shelley's mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, had been dead and buried for more than 50 years. This all happened in 1851 after Mary Shelley died, and she was placed in this tomb alongside the skeletal remains of her parents. Then, a few decades later, in 1889, Percy Florence Shelley, the only surviving child of Percy Bysshe and Mary, was also buried here. And then 10 years after that, in 1899, Jane Shelley, the daughter-in-law who engineered all this tomb business, was herself buried here. Around this time, the remains of Percy Bysshe Shelley's heart were also placed here, having been rescued from the cremated remains where his body was cremated in Italy after he drowned. The biographer Charlotte Gordon points out that there is no mention of Mary Shelley's literary work on this tomb. It simply says Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, daughter of William and Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, and widow of the late Percy Bysshe Shelley, born August 30th, 1797, died February 1st, 1851. No mention of her novels, no mention of her most famous novel, Frankenstein. And Gordon argues that this tomb is as much about Lady Jane as it is about her famous mother-in-law. This is Lady Jane putting herself in this family and making it seem more respectable. Mary Shelley is defined as the widow of her famous poet husband, and there is no mention of the scandalous novel Frankenstein.
At least the plaque on the wall outside the graveyard does a better job of advertising Mary Shelley, listing the title of her most famous work, Frankenstein, and displaying her name in bigger letters than her parents and husband. After all, they have their own memorials elsewhere. Percy Bysshe Shelley's ashes, sans heart, were interred under this simple grave slab in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. The inscription does not mention that he was the husband of Mary Shelley. Another, grander memorial is found in Oxford, at University College, where Percy Bysshe Shelley was briefly a student before they expelled him. This 13-ton sculpture, unveiled in 1893, had originally been intended for Percy's grave before it was deemed too grand for the cemetery. It was created by Edward Onslow Ford and commissioned by Lady Jane Shelley, perhaps another attempt to make her in-laws, and therefore herself, seem grander and more respectable. Percy's body was carved from white marble like an ancient Greek or Roman hero, splayed out on an altar as if he had just washed up on the beach after he drowned in the Mediterranean Sea. Holding up the altar are two winged lions and a topless woman representing the poetic muse. Quotations from Percy's poem Adonis, written about the death of John Keats, are displayed on the walls under a star-studded sky. Again, no mention of Mary, and certainly no mention of Frankenstein, although Percy does look like an ideal cadaver for Victor Frankenstein to experiment on. To see Mary included in a memorial, we have to go back to Bournemouth, to Christchurch Priory, 5 miles up the road from Mary's grave. This marble sculpture depicts Mary cradling her dead husband. It was installed in 1854 and also commissioned by Lady Jane. Unsurprisingly, the inscription mentions Percy's poetry, but not Mary's own writing. But I think the sculpture itself is rather lovely. The composition makes Mary seem just as important as her husband, the sculptor Henry Weeks emphasising the care and devotion of Mary as much as the tragedy of Percy. And, like University College and the graveyards of St Pancras and St Mary's, it is a poignant place to reflect and remember those who have passed away.
Although it feels a bit random that Mary Shelley is buried here rather than in St Pancras, this just happened to be where her son and daughter-in-law lived, I actually think it's really fitting that she's buried so close to the sea. Not only does she reference the sea throughout Frankenstein and her other work, the sea also has such a long and deep literary connection to death and mourning. And she evokes this connection in one of her poems about the death of her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley. These are the last 2 stanzas of her poem, The Dirge, published in 1831. From far across the sea, love, I hear a wild lament, by echo's voice for thee, love, from ocean's cavern sent. O list, O list, O list, the spirits of the deep, loud sound their wail of sorrow, while I forever weep.
But perhaps the best memorial to Mary Shelley isn't in any of the places we've visited, but is instead found in the pages of her books and the words she wrote.